I got absolutely
Sorry.
fascinated by the natural sciences very early on, but in a much broader context. And I kept that context for the rest of my life.
Mm. But I also know from what you have told me before that it wasn't always easy in your life to hold both of these passions together. Can you tell us a little bit of how did that go develop when you went to university in Cambridge?
Well, by the time I went to university, I was convinced that Christianity was true. And this is a very important question, of course. Many people are involved in a religion because they find it helpful, and that's, of course, a good reason. But I believe that Christianity was true, and therefore I was impelled inwardly to read as much as I could of people who didn't share that worldview. And when I reached Cambridge, I met quite a few of those people. But I found in general that most students were intrigued at why I believed what I believed. And I had many, many discussions, but I think Julia's referring to one occasion when a Nobel Prize winner tried to dissuade me and tried to force me to give up my Christian faith. It was at a dinner in my Cambridge college, and I was sitting beside him, and I asked him about his work. And I risked asking him whether the work that had won him the Nobel Prize had ever indicated to him that there might be a creator. And he became quite angry, and that ended the conversation. And he turned to his neighbor, and I thought that was the end of it. But at the end of the dinner, he said to me, "Lennox, come to my room." And it wasn't an invitation, it was a command. So I went to his room, and as far as I can remember, there were several other senior members of the college there, no other students, and I was put in a chair and they stood. It was a very strange situation, and he said, "Do you want a career in science?" And I said, "Yes, I do." Well, he said, "Then tonight in front of witnesses, give up this naive faith in Christianity, because if you hold on to it, you will suffer in comparison with your fellow students. You'll never make it. So give it up." And it was an amazing pressure. I mean, incredible. But from somewhere, I got the courage to ask him, "What have you got to offer me that is better than what I already have?" And he said, he mentioned a particular philosophy, um, evolutionism, and a special form of it. And I knew all about it. And I said, "If that's all you've got, then I will stick with Christianity and I'll take the risk." And I got up and walked out. And somehow that changed me. It put steel into my heart, and it made me resolve never, ever to do that kind of thing in reverse. In other words, if ever I managed to achieve any kind of academic status, never to browbeat people into believing Christianity. What I wanted to do was put the evidence on the table and encourage people to make up their own minds. It was a very important incident. And of course, I realized that if he'd been a Christian and I'd been an atheist, he would have lost his job the next day. By the way, the philosophy he tried to bring to me was Bergson. And that was a very bad choice, because Bergson actually would have become a Catholic if it hadn't been for some reputational matters. And it was absolutely ridiculous that he would suggest to me to imbibe this philosophy as something better than Christianity when Bergson was moving towards Christianity. But such is the world. And I realized that there's a dark side to academia. There are people that will try to pressurize people And that was absolutely unscientific for him to do that.
As far as I can tell, you have stayed very faithful to your commitment to not pressure people into anything. You are one of the most gracious people I have known, and when we see your debates, you can see them online, watch them on YouTube. You always have this, as you said, put the evidence on the table, but then also be really, really gracious and friendly to your opponents, and try to win them over, not just by your arguments, but also by your tone. Is that very much what you have experienced when debating people like Richard Dawkins?
Absolutely, and it stems from that basic attitude that every person I speak to is made in the image of God, so I take them seriously. So if I'm debating Dawkins or Hitchens, I read most of what I can of what they say and try to take their argument seriously and walk in their shoes, so to speak. And then I ask myself these questions. Do these make sense? Has Christianity got any answer? And I found that it abundantly has, which is why I'm not an atheist.
So I think your professor was wrong. Christianity has not been a disadvantage for your career in science, because you've made an amazing career in science, but you've also dedicated much of your life to show that science and faith they do fit together, and that we can make sense of both worlds. I work a lot at universities and go around and speak to people about that. And I was just in Berlin, very, very atheistic campus. And one of the students actually said to me, well, but science has made faith redundant, hasn't it? And as you said, many people today think it's really naive to have a faith, and that Christianity is actually an opponent to science. In a nutshell, what would you tell a student who would come up with a thought like that for you today?
In a nutshell.
Because I have other questions to ask you.
Well, it's such an interesting question, Julia, or statement. Science has made faith redundant. My first question to that student would be, what do you mean by faith? Faith in what? Of course, they mean faith in God, but the difficulty here is that the word faith, both in English and German, has two meanings at least. It can stand for religious faith, or it can mean my personal faith in anything. That England's going to win the World Cup, for example.
Which they won't.
And the point of that is very important, because often the person making that statement thinks that faith is not involved in science, which is completely false. So when people ask me to talk about science and faith, I say, faith in what? Do you mean faith in God, or do you mean faith in science? Because faith is absolutely essential in science. That is the subjective kind of faith, trust. And Einstein, so we'll go back to Switzerland here for Einstein. Einstein was the one that saw that very clearly. He said, I cannot imagine a genuine scientist without that faith. Now, he did not mean faith in a personal God. What he meant in saying that was faith in the rational intelligibility of nature, faith in the mathematical understandability of nature, or putting it simply, faith that we can do science. You see, you cannot do science without faith that it can be done. So it is a remarkable thing to oppose science and faith. What, of course, they really mean is that you can't be a religious person and have faith in God and be a scientist. But history is against them. The first point I would make, you want a nutshell. This is a fairly large nutshell, but I'll keep it as small as possible. One of the things that I find fascinating is the history of modern science, beginning, let's say, with Galileo, followed by Kepler, Newton, and then Clerk Maxwell and Faraday and a lot of other people. Every one of those people was a believer in God. And historians and philosophers of science have seen that there's a link between the two, even atheist philosophers. And the link between the two was well formulated by C.S. Lewis, who was reading Alfred North Whitehead. And he said men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So I often say to people, I'm not remotely ashamed of being a scientist and a Christian, because arguably it was the Judeo-Christian worldview that gave me my subject. You see, belief in a creator has spawned a great deal of science. And now for people to say, well, science has made God redundant is rather strange. But of course he hasn't. Science has got rid of a lot of false gods, and that's important to see. And one of the false gods that science has removed is the so-called God of the gaps. And I should say something about that, if I may I?
Yes, sure.
Because very often, well, let me put it this way in a concrete instance. I was very intrigued when Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, who was a genius, I remember him at Cambridge, said, you've got to choose between science and God. And I could never understand that, because Newton didn't feel that, nor did Clerk Maxwell, Faraday, and a whole lot of other people, and Charles Babbage, the father of computing, if you're a computer scientist, until I realized that Hawking was not talking about the God of the Bible. He was talking about the Greek kind of God, this kind. I don't understand what lightning is or thunder. So because I don't understand them, I postulate a God behind them. And a little bit of atmospheric physics at the University of Freiburg, that God disappears, because it was a God of the gaps. But you see, Christianity does not believe in a God of the gaps. And Isaac Newton, interestingly, when he discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, oh, now I've got the science, I don't need God. No, he wrote the most brilliant book in the whole history of science, hoping, as he said in the introduction, that it would help a reasonable person to believe in a deity, in God. In other words, it was the science he understood that pointed towards a God. And that's very important. I believe that science points towards God, but not the science I don't know, not the stuff that hasn't been solved yet. It's the stuff I know. And that's hugely important. So let me put it a third way. The Bible starts with the words, in the beginning, God created the bits of the universe that we don't yet understand. Well, it doesn't actually. It starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which is a Hebrew way of saying everything, the bits we know and the bits we don't know. And it's the bits we know that indicates that an intelligence lies behind the universe, as Newton saw, and Kepler saw, and Galileo saw, and many other contemporary scientists say. And my final point, Yulia, here would be this. The battle is not between science and faith in God. That's crucially important. And you can see that very easily. Take the Nobel Prize for Physics. Not long ago, a Scotsman, Peter Higgs, won it. And a while before that, Bill Phillips won it. Now, they're both geniuses. What's the difference between them? Well, Higgs is an atheist and Phillips is a Christian. So science doesn't divide them. They're both equally brilliant. What does divide them? Their worldview. One is an atheist, the other a Christian. And what I'd like to say to all of you is this. This is a worldview battle. The worldviews, the chief worldviews that come into it are atheism and theism, and there are brilliant scientists on both sides. And what you have to answer is not, does science make God redundant? That's not true. It's impossible anyway. But where does science point? Does it point towards atheism in your view, or does it point towards theism? That's what you've got to make up your mind about. And that's the key question that I've tried to answer most of my life.
Well, that's a very interesting one. And one of the arguments that is used when we say, well, science might actually point to a God is the argument of so-called fine-tuning. So the complexity of this world, and that actually ultimately must point to a creator God. Could you explain this argument a little bit more and what?
Well, let me contextualize that in a story. I was asked by one of Oxford's leading philosophers, who is an atheist, to come to talk to his students who were mostly atheists. He said, they're going to grill you, but we'll give you a good dinner afterwards. Okay, I said, that's fine. So I chatted to him beforehand, and he said, look, I hope you're going to use the best argument against atheism that I know. And I was intrigued by this. I said, what is, in your opinion, the best argument against atheism? And he, without hesitation, he said, John, it's the fine-tuning that we find in physics. If I were ever to cross the line and become a Christian, part of the reason would be fine-tuning. It's very difficult to explain by any other means than that there is a God. And the fine-tuning argument is very simple. It's that it's simple if you know a lot of physics, in the sense that it depends on the knowledge that fundamental constants of nature, and there are quite a few of these, have to be within very small tolerances for there to be a universe in existence on which carbon-based life is possible. And one of them, for example, it's pretty obvious. The simple ones are obvious. If the Earth was further away from the sun, life would be impossible because it would be too cold. And if the Earth were nearer the sun, then it would be too hot. And there are many simple parameters like that. But when you get into the basic fundamental forces of nature, perhaps the most extreme one is the one thought of by Sir Roger Penrose, who's probably the brightest mathematician around today in Oxford, who worked with Stephen Hawking on black holes. And Sir Roger he is essentially a humanist, he's an atheist. But he said in one of his writings, and these are more or less his words, he said, if you're going to have a universe with a second law of thermodynamics, which being simply interpreted is whatever car you've got will rust eventually, things go from order to disorder. If you're going to have a universe like that, then the creator's aim has got to be accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123. Which is a number so great that if you write a 1 here and then a number of zeros, the number of zeros exceeds the number of elementary particles in the entire universe. And leading scientists, practically all of them, see that the fine-tuning is real and therefore that it demands an explanation. And I've written about it in my book, God and Stephen Hawking. And it seems to me that that is one of the very clear things that point towards God. Now, I know that people object with the many universes theory, and I'm not going to go into that now. You can read my book if you want. It's actually in German as well. So we leave it at that. But fine-tuning is impressive, and it is something that is worth mentioning. It is a pointer from the nature of nature to the existence of an intelligence behind nature.
And I think the fact that people have come up with a different theory to explain fine-tuning, namely, as you said, the multiverse theory or the many universe theory, is actually maybe also pointing to the fact that even atheists agree that, yes, this is something we need to explain.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Find another explanation for this. I remember once you said, John, that well, we have different gaps. You said we don't believe in the God of the gaps, but there are good gaps and bad gaps.
Yeah.
So some of the good gaps that we might actually think, oh, these are actually good pointers towards the existence of God is, if I'm not mistaken, how do we come from non-existence to existence of the universe? And fine-tuning comes in with this. How can we come from non-life to life? And then the third good gap, so to say, is how do we come from non-consciousness to consciousness? And I think this has been, a lot of researchers have been looking into this, this whole question of conscious and how did conscious beings develop? And some theistic science would argue that actually there's a difference between consciousness and our mind. So the mind and the brain, so the mind-brain gap, and that this also points to God. Can you maybe explain a little bit and elaborate on that one?
Well, you've made quite a number of very interesting points there. I'm glad you remember that I talked about good gaps and bad gaps. And I don't think that's due to myself, actually. It's due to my teacher of quantum mechanics, John Polkinghorne, who taught me. And he said on one occasion that we are unashamedly people of the gaps, but there are good gaps. In other words, there are gaps that science opens up. They're the good gaps. The gaps that science closes are the bad gaps. And you're absolutely right. The one that interests me most at the moment is the origin of life question. And it's fascinating reading what is going on in that area. And again, I've written about that in a recent book. But you mentioned consciousness and the brain. And the interesting thing here, Yulia, is that no one knows what consciousness is. That is one of my questions that I raise in the whole discussion about artificial intelligence, about which I've written quite a bit. And that is, people who say we're going to build consciousness, well, fine. I say, what is it? And they have no idea. The experts have no idea what consciousness is. But what you pointed out was, I think, the case that there is a difference between the brain and consciousness. And you will know that a very popular view, I think, expounded in a book that originates in Berlin, I am my brain. Well, I don't think I am my brain, because there's a mind story and a brain story. If you put all kinds of sensors on my head, you can deduce certain things about what's happening in my brain. That's the brain story. But only I can give you the mind story. I can't give you the brain story, but I can give you the mind story, what's going on in my mind. And consciousness is one of those vast mysteries to science. We just don't know. Speaking as a scientist, we just don't know. It is a colossal mystery. And the problem is we live in a world where the dominant academic philosophy is materialism and reductionist physicalism. In other words, everything in the end can be reduced to physics and chemistry. But the great difficulty comes when you try to reduce the phenomenon of consciousness, like qualia, what it's like to be a bat, for example, or sensation of color, to physics and chemistry. It just doesn't work. And that points to me that there is a vast gap between materialist philosophy, and I would point out that the central Christian claim, of course, is that God is spirit. The ultimate reality in the universe is not physical at all. But the existence of consciousness, whatever it is, seems to me to indicate that there's something beyond the material, because we can use our consciousness to create signs in writing, for example, that have meaning. And it is very difficult to reduce those to physics and chemistry, as I have discovered in interviewing many scientists about this and asking them about a menu on a table. I usually do it at dinner. When they tell me that they're reductionists and all the rest, I pick up the menu and point to it. And they say, well, it says roast chicken. What's special about that? I say, nothing at all. But you are a reductionist. And how do you know that means roast? Well, I've learned English. Oh, I see. And those signs along that page mean roast. All right, you're a reductionist. You explain those signs to me, the meaning of them, in terms of physics and chemistry. And on one famous occasion, this biochemist, who was very famous, said, I believed for 40 years that it can be done, going into my lab, and I now see it can't. It was an amazing confession. And I said, oh, well, physics and chemistry have only been going 500 years or so. He said, it doesn't matter. You cannot find the meaning in the physics and chemistry. And he looked at me and saw that I wasn't bright enough to think of that argument. He said, where did you get that argument? I said, don't worry. I got it from a Nobel Prize winner, Roger Sperry, who worked on the brain and consciousness and made this point. So as scientists, we're standing before a mystery, as scientists. Now, as a Christian, I can go a bit further and say that at the heart of the universe, there's a vast consciousness, which we call God. We know something about him, but I suspect not very much. But then, as a Christian, I believe God has revealed himself in a person who was conscious, and that is Jesus Christ. So it's just a huge question, and it's a huge gap. So people trying to build conscious robots, well, if you don't know what consciousness is, that's simply Spinnerei.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. We're obviously just tackling on some of those arguments. If you want to know more and if you want to, John, to elaborate on that, please ask later in the Q&A. John, you've already touched on the idea of how did we come from non-life to life. So how did life actually come about on this planet? And obviously, this is one of the other very strong arguments I often hear from people. So while you Christians, you believe in, the creation of the world in 6 days, and we struggle with this in the light of what we know about evolutions, and that doesn't fit together. How would you, as a Christian, read Genesis, a Christian and a scientist, read Genesis 1 and 2? And then I would also love to know about your newest findings on that development.
Well, there are several different questions hidden there. First of all, the shift from non-life to life has got nothing to do with evolution. Many people don't realize that. I mean, scientifically, nothing to do with it. Because whatever Darwinian type evolution does or doesn't do, it cannot produce life because it depends on life to do anything. Now, even Richard Dawkins missed that for many years in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, but he did in the end admit that this was true, that the shift from non-life to life is not accounted for by evolution. So it remains a completely separate question. And by the way, in order to have life at all, you must have a fine-tuned universe. So nothing that is said about biology can knock down the fine-tuning arguments. And there are increasingly fine-tuning arguments in biology. Now, the question you have asked is a question of interpreting the Bible, which is a very different question. And that is, if you look at Genesis at the beginning, you read an account of 7 days, a very famous account of the creation and organization of the world. And you immediately run into the obvious problem that from any reasonable dating perspective within geophysics, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old and the universe of 13.8 or something like that billion years old. And therefore you run into an immediate difficulty. If you take those days at face value, that they are literal days. Now, I take scripture very seriously, and what I notice is that the word day in Genesis 1 has 4 different meanings, not just one. And that indicates to me it's very sophisticated writing. If you want me to mention them, I can very briefly. Let's take the first mention of day. And God called the light day and the darkness he called night. That's less than 24 hours. That's rather intriguing. The day is the 12 hours of daylight, our experience of sunlight. The second meaning, evening and morning, day one. That would be the normal way of describing what we call a 24-hour day in Hebrew thought. That's the second meaning. Then on the day 7, God rested, but there's no evening and morning mentioned. And that deliberately, as even the church fathers saw thousands of years ago, or at least, a long time ago, nearly 2,000 years, sorry, nearly 2,000 years ago. They felt that the reason was that God rested, but he didn't start creating again. And that rest, that 7th-day rest, holds until now. So there is, by virtually common consent, one very long day. Now, finally, in chapter 2, at the beginning, it says, when God made heaven and earth in most translations, but in Hebrew it's actually in the day God made heaven and earth. Well, that's clearly the use of the word day. In English, I think German does the same thing. I can say in English, in my young day, I went to Cambridge. Well, that wasn't Tuesday or Wednesday. It was a period of 7 years. And so the word day appears in chapter 2 of Genesis as indicating an indefinite period of time. So there are your 4 meanings. And that tells me immediately, this is sophisticated writing. Be very careful with it. And of course, people say, but look, one of those readings is a 24-hour day. It is. But Hebrew grammar is interesting, you see. In many versions, I think including the one at least of the German version, it says the first day, der erste Tag, der zweite Tag. But the interesting thing is, on the 6th and the 7th, the article doesn't exist, the definite article. There's no der. It just says sechster Tag, siebter Tag, 6th day, 7th day. And the interesting thing with that is that that is not the normal way that you would describe a single Earth week. You'd either have them all with the definite article, or them all with the indefinite article, or them all anarthrous, that is, without any article, day 1, day 2, day 3. You're counting a sequence of days. Now, suppose, just for sake of thought, they were 24-hour days. Why do we believe necessarily that they're days of a single Earth week? You see, there's another logical possibility, and that is that these are days when God injected a new level of organization and information. And that wouldn't have taken long, but it would have taken a long time for them to settle down. So the days of Genesis 1 could have been actual 24-hour days, but separated by very long periods of time. So that's another view that many people have never heard of. But coming to the age of the Earth, the most interesting thing is again grammatical. And that is, there are 2 past tenses in Hebrew. And the first verse is, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, are in one past tense. And then the sequence of days is in another past tense. And I have asked several professors of Hebrew, including those at Oxford and Cambridge, just to check up what that means. And what they tell me it means is the difference in the tenses is that the first use, in the beginning, represents creation at an indefinite period in the past. So what does the Bible say about the age of the world or the universe? Nothing at all, so far as I know. So I think it's a bit of a pity if Christians get hung up on it. And the irony of that is this, that no matter what you believe about the days, it doesn't tell you that the earth or the universe is young. So there are more sophisticated readings. And I would want to argue that there are ways of reading that do not force us into a huge clash with widely accepted science. But there's another example of this, you see. I very rarely meet someone, I don't think I've ever met a serious person who believes that the earth does not move. And yet the Bible says it doesn't move. The Psalms say that God has fixed it on pillars so that it shouldn't move. Now, if you asked me that question, Julia, 500 years ago, well, you wouldn't have asked me that question. You wouldn't have been interested in the days. What you would have been interested in is, look, we hear that there's a man called Galileo and he's saying the earth moves, but you're a biblical person. Surely you can't believe that, since the Bible it says it doesn't move. Today, I do believe the earth moves, and I suspect most of you watching me believe that it moves. Well, you don't believe the Bible then. Or is there another possibility? So here's the way I approach this. It's possible to interpret the Bible that the earth doesn't move. But most people now have come to the conclusion that that is actually a deeper metaphor that means that it's stable. God has built into it regularities and so on. It's not to be taken literalistically. You can interpret it literalistically, but you get into huge trouble. And I want to argue simply that the days are exactly the same. You can interpret them, if you like, to represent a single week, even though that doesn't necessarily make the earth young, but you don't have to. And therefore, it seems to me that it's sad that there's so much heat generated by this. I've also written a book on it, which is in German, 7 Days That Divide the World, if you want to read more about it. But I think that's all I'd say about it.
Thank you. You have very beautifully and very insightful demonstrated how we don't, as Christians, don't have to be afraid of science, but how we can actually keep those two together. Just one last question before we come to the Q&A, so it's open for all of you to ask questions. You've already hinted at that one as well. One of the newest developments of science is actually AI, so artificial intelligence. One of the questions I would like to ask you is, do we have to be afraid of AI as Christians? And then maybe another one, obviously there are some people transhumanists, who would say, oh, one day as man, we will be able to merge with a machine, and then we might even have eternal life. What would you say to things like that?
Well, first of all, there are things to be very happy about with artificial intelligence. It has been wonderful in creating new drugs and preparing vaccines. It's going to save a lot of work, but it is going to create a massive number of problems, especially with job losses, and we need to think seriously about those. So the way I approach it is simply this, that there are two kinds of AI. There's the kind that is working at the moment, which is narrow AI, a system that does one thing and one thing only that normally requires human intelligence, like facial recognition. And that's wonderful. You can use it to pick out a criminal in a crowd, but you can also use it to suppress a population, an ethnic minority, as is happening, as you know, in some parts of the world and could happen here. I often say to people, look, AI is like any other technology. It's like a knife. You can use a sharp knife for surgery or you can use it for murder. And therefore, we need Christians to be working in these fields who know what's going on and who can take part in developing the ethical policy for them, because the technology is developing far faster than the ethical underpinning. Now, as to your other question, the merging with machines and so on, there's a lot of science fiction with that, but at the same time, there are leading scientists who believe it and are very much sold out to the transhumanist agenda that we will solve the basic problems of human existence. Harari is one of the best people to read if you want to know what that agenda is. In his book Homo Deus, he says that the two major agenda items for the 21st century are: one, to solve the problem of physical death. It's a medical problem, technical problem. And secondly, to enhance human happiness. Now, when I read this agenda and somebody tries to sell it to me, I say, the problem is with that, you're too late. And they say, but we haven't solved it yet. I said, yes, but the problem of physical death has been solved. 20 centuries ago, Jesus Christ was raised from the dead by God. And simultaneously, that solves your second problem, because he promises to those that repent and receive him as Lord and Savior that they will receive a new kind of life, and that therefore in the future the greatest upload that you can conceive of will happen when he raises believers from the dead. So that gives them a bit of a shock that the goal of transhumanism has already been realized. It's no accident that many of the people pushing this agenda are atheists. But this is a huge question, Julia. And I'm pleased to say that my book, 2084, 2084, is in German and available for you.
Well, that's great to hear you have a book written on every question we could possibly ask. And I really do recommend John's books. Some of them are on the bookstore here. Some of them are available on Amazon or your local bookshop. Thank you so much. This was a very, very broad sort of journey through different times. We now have a time of Q&A. Thank you for already sending in some of your questions. You can also vote up questions. So you think this is my question, you don't have to put it in there again. You find it on the app, you can just vote it up. And I'll try to get as many in as possible. We still do have quite a good time up there. So here's someone, Iliana, asking that, following this line of we have different arguments for the existence of God, and we've mentioned some of them, which is great. But then, you might be able to argue for theism, but that still leaves quite a lot of religions open. How do we then argue for a Christian God from a scientific perspective?
Well, that's probably one of the best questions to think about, because it's a totally legitimate question. Often I get it asked by perceptive people who see that what I've been arguing from, particularly if we've been emphasizing science, that I believe science points to an intelligent creator. And then the question comes, but you're a Christian. Why that God? Well, I'll tell you. I'll give you the reasons as rapidly as I can. But I think the fundamental thing is this, that it is a question that can lead to a lot of emotion and conflict. And the reason is this, that when people start differentiating between religions, often the audience feels that they're down on everybody else and they think they're morally superior to everybody else. So let me say right at the very beginning that the reason I'm a Christian is not because I believe I'm morally superior to someone who advocates some other religion. I'm not. In fact, the basic reason I'm a Christian is that Christ has solved my basic problem that I'm not moral, that I'm sinful, that I don't even keep my own rules, let alone God's rules. But I would like to make a general point that if you look at all the philosophies and religions in the world, you will find, as C.S. Lewis did in 1940 and wrote about it in his book, The Abolition of Man, which everybody ought to read, he noticed that the golden rule was in every one of them without exception. That is, do unto others what you would that they did to you. In other words, people are moral beings and they have a good sense of morality. So when I talk about the difference between religions to indicate why I am a Christian, I'm not suggesting that I'm morally better than anybody else. In fact, non-Christians could put me to shame. And you read examples in the Bible of non-believers putting believers to shame, notably Abraham, but not only him. That's the first point. We are all moral beings. We've all got moral standards. We're made in the image of God. But now, the reason I'm a Christian is that Christ offers me something that none of the other religions offer me. And I've tried to understand them in detail. Because what Christ offers me is, first of all, forgiveness for all that I've done wrong, and a new life that starts in this life. Let me put it this way. Talking to representatives of religions, I often am told that religion is like a university course. You have some sort of entrance ceremony, you get into the university, then you are taught by people, and eventually you have an examination. And if you do well enough, you are received into heaven, whatever comes after university. Those teachers are there, but they cannot help you get a degree. It's on the basis of your merit. And they say it's exactly the same with God. God gives us rules and regulations. If we keep them, then we're assessed at a judgment. And if we do enough good in our lives, then we're received into whatever passes the name of heaven, nirvana, or something like that. And I say, yes, that's absolutely true. That is religion. And if that is religion, Christianity is not a religion. And that shocks a lot of people. But you see, it's true. Christianity is not based on human merit. It's not like a university at all. And it's because of that that I can say to you sitting here without pride that I know that God has received me in spite of all that I've done wrong, not because of my merit, no, but because that Christ has died for me. It's because of his merit, what he has done. Now that's utterly unique. And you see, because it's unique, it's no shame to accept something from Jesus Christ that nobody else offers me. He doesn't compete with anybody because he offers me something that no one else offers me. Now, we could say a lot more about that, but that is hugely important. I'm not criticizing the morality of any other religion, but what I am saying is that the method of being related to God in Christianity, I find, is the only one that makes sense of me as a person. And the fact that Christ receives me in this life and guarantees me a future life beyond death, well, is unique. And I've accepted that from him. I don't find it anywhere else.
Thank you. That's very insightful. And I think it's also an answer to another question that was asked about how you personally handle talking about an objective truth, which, from what I assume, you think Jesus is, without sounding arrogant or ignorant. Would you go answer, give a similar answer to that, or do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
I would give a similar answer to that, because Jesus is the only one who ever said, I am the truth, and was taken seriously. Notice he didn't say, I say true things, although that was true. I am the truth. That's a huge claim. And stating the truth is not arrogance, as you'll find in most walks of life, except postmodern courses on language in universities. Every other sphere of life, we believe in truth. All of us believe in truth. The idea that all is relative is nonsense, because if I say to you, everything is relative, there's no such thing as truth, I'm expecting you to believe that that is true. So I do believe in absolute truth. So I think we're not in a post-truth world, no matter who claims it. But we need to be careful with our claims, or they can come across as arrogant. And in our contemporary society, people regard certainty as arrogance, particularly certainty in this sphere. If I said I'm certain that England is going to play Scotland at football this evening, then people would accept that perfectly well. And the people in the audience knew that at 1 o'clock, Schweizerzeit, John Lennox would be speaking to them. They believed that was true. That's why they're sitting in front of me at the moment. So we all believe in truth. But the way in which we hold that truth is important. And we need to avoid any trace of arrogance. But you see, it's not arrogance when you know that something will cure you of a disease. It's not arrogance to recommend it to other people.
Thank you. I think that's very
important. It's love, actually. It's love. It's not arrogance.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. I think it's something we have talked about as well, as we're thinking about how can we be cultural witnesses, this whole aspect of being respectful and being
absolutely, yes.
And that has come up quite a lot. So here's another question going back to what you didn't want to talk about, but I said, well, questions might bring it out of you. I know you've written a book on it, but what do you actually think about the multiverse theory and its implications on creation by God? It's a question.
Sorry, what do I think about what?
Sorry, this is a completely different topic. Going back to what you said about the multiverse theory. So here's someone who would, he I think is willing to read your book on it, but he would love to hear a little bit of you.
Oh, I see. Now. The idea is that there are so many universes that there must be one of them in which everything possible can happen. Well, this is usually based in quantum mechanics, and within the experts, which I am not, in the quantum mechanical field, there are vast differences. My own teacher, John Polkinghorne, didn't believe in multiverses and pointed out that it's much more economical to believe in one creator who has evidenced himself in creation than in an infinite number of multiverses to which there is no access. You see, it's postulating things to which there is no access. And I just feel it strains credulity to the extreme. And therefore, I reject it. You see, let me put it this way, and it's important. I'm a pure mathematician. So in my field, you can have proof, exact proof of things. But outside pure mathematics, you don't get exact proof. You simply have evidence. You can have a basis for an inference. and for trust. And that's the way normal life is. I've been married to the same woman for 56 years nearly. I can't prove to you mathematically that she loves me, but I'd give my life for it because I see enough evidence to trust her. And it's important. Every day we exercise trust because we think there's sufficient evidence, but we couldn't prove it in any exact sense. And it's the same when it comes to God. I have been careful to say through this talk that science points towards God, but it doesn't give you a mathematical proof in the sense that, well, you'd be a fool not to accept that. It's obviously that is the truth. It's pointers, it's evidence, but they're very strong. And you see, you need to take into account a second thing, that God is a person, not just a theory. And to believe truth about persons has to do with relationship as well as factual propositional evidence. And those two things come together, so it's cumulative. And I've tried to say, it would take too long actually to go into detail, I'm sorry, but if you're really keen to know what I think about multiverses, have a look at my little book, God and Stephen Hawking. I've said all I can say there. There are some people, by the way, who do believe both in God and the multiverse. And the interesting thing about that is, including one of Hawking's collaborators, the interesting thing about that is the multiverse is not an argument against God, interestingly enough. But I'll have to leave that one there.
Yeah, from how I understand it, the multiverse makes it even more complicated and more complex. So there might be a God even behind the multiverses, and that's not, that doesn't exclude God. Thank you so much. So here's another question about someone who says, I'm an American and I go to an evangelical church, and where there's a lot of skepticism towards science from members. Where does this come from? So where do you think this skepticism of Christians towards science actually originates from, and how can we actually challenge them? I think that's also an important one.
Well, I'm glad he wants to. That is a question to which I don't know the answer, in the sense that I don't know your church, and I don't want to ask which one it is, but there have been groups, sadly, of Christians that have been skeptical of science because they think that science has taken young people particularly away from God. And sadly, in my mind, some of them have used the argument that young people who have been taught that God created the world in 6 actual days of 1 earth week have gone to university and have come back rejecting that. And they regard that as an absolute necessity for fellowship. Well, I think that's very sad. And that's part of it. And it's an absolute tragedy, because I want to be open to truth from wherever it comes. And the God of the Bible is the God of the universe, and he wants us to be interested in the universe. Isn't it fascinating that one of the first jobs God gave to human beings was to name animals? Taxonomy is the basic academic discipline, and naming things is what all scientists are involved in, really. So God started science in that sense. That particular science was biology, believe it or not. And my sadness is that concentrating on things where there are genuine differences between Christians that should not cause people to fight with each other have caused people to fight with each other. And I'm just sad as to how it can be challenged. I just don't know. Some people will change their minds, some will never change their minds. But I think it's very important to know in your own heart and work out a way of witnessing to this, so that you are not written off as a crank because you appear to believe something that doesn't make sense. Now, let me say to that, I'm prepared for people to say to me, look, you you cannot be taken seriously because you don't believe in the laws of nature, because you believe in miracles. And I'm prepared to stand up and argue the case for the resurrection of Jesus and all those major things. But it's when you notice people taking against science on the basis of doctrines that not all Christians agree about. Let me put that a different way. You can meet believers who are very clear on the fact of creation, the miracles of Jesus, his deity, his death, his resurrection, and his coming again. They agree on all of those things, but they disagree about Genesis 1. Now that's very interesting. That means that we should have latitude of heart in our attitude to those believers. But the difficulty is that some of our dear brothers and sisters maybe, but mostly brothers, I suspect, have such a hardened attitude here that they will regard fellowship with you as depending on whether you agree to their interpretation. Now, that's going beyond Scripture, and that's untenable, it seems to me. But how you deal with it is with grace, a lot of patience and wisdom, and putting your efforts where they actually have a chance of doing something good.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Very insightful. Here's another question about communication and witnessing, but actually in another sphere, in your own field of mathematics. How can you communicate the gospel well in the language of mathematics or to mathematicians?
The same way as I communicated to most people. I think when it comes to communicating the gospel, the number one thing is your own experience, which no one can take from you. You see, when the Apostle Paul, who was a very bright person indeed, when he was put on trial, the first thing he went to was the reality of his experience of meeting Christ. No one can take that from you. But if you mean, how can you use mathematics as a bridge to people's minds? That's a slightly different question. And my way in there would be that one of the reasons I believe in God is because I can do mathematics. And that goes back to Einstein that I mentioned earlier, that the very fact that mathematics works in our understanding of the universe, as Einstein and others saw, is an absolute mystery if you don't believe in God. There's a famous Nobel Prize winner called Eugene Wigner, who wrote a paper in 1961 entitled The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And Wigner was an atheist. And I understand that from an atheist perspective. The fact that mathematics works is entirely unreasonable. But as a Christian, it's entirely reasonable, because the fact that the human mind in here works in some way to understand the universe out there, when both the mind and the universe were created by an intelligent God, that to my mind is perfectly reasonable. And it's that way I would approach it. Also, it is quite remarkable to list a number of mathematicians who believed in God, and you can do a bit of research and find that out yourself. Some of them Swiss. So that's a very good thing to do, that mathematics hasn't prevented people from believing in God, rather the contrary in many instances.
John, you have witnessed, and I hinted to that in my introduction, to a number of very, very skeptical people throughout your life by debating, for example, Richard Dawkins, who was a very, very fierce atheist. You also wrote about the new atheism. And Richard Dawkins has just recently stated that he finds himself to be a cultural Christian. Someone asked, were you astonished about that statement? What do you think about it?
Well, not very much, because it seems to me to contradict what he really says. cultural Christianity, if that's how he defines it, he likes singing in church at Christmas, he likes the atmosphere and so on. That's one thing. But he clearly disbelieves the central claims of Christianity, that Jesus is the Son of God, that he rose from the dead, and therefore he's not a Christian. Cultural Christianity therefore doesn't mean either that he is a Christian or is moving towards Christianity. I think it's simply a way of perhaps being a little bit more pleasant, which is no shame in his case. And I'm glad he enjoys these things. But if he enjoys them, that might be a reason to ask, why is he enjoying them? Is it because they're actually true? They're giving him a message which he's not picking up because he's rejecting it. And that's the way I would approach that. I think to be a cultural Christian and to enjoy these things, you need to move to be a real Christian. Otherwise, you're just living a contradiction.
But there are actually quite a few people from the sort of new atheism sphere who have recently professed faith in Christ. And if anyone of you is interested in hearing more about that, there's a new podcast by someone called Justin Briley called The Surprising Rebirth of Christianity. And he interviews several quite famous people who have just recently become Christians. So very, very interesting. I want to listen to you if you want to know more. So coming back to signs, and this might be one of our, not the last, but maybe the penultimate questions. Someone is asking, what do you think of near-death experience? We've talked about the question of conscience, and that is linked to this whole, the signs into looking into near-death experience. What do you make of it?
Well, I can only say what my own experience has been, because I've been within a few seconds of death myself. And if you don't mind me sharing my own experience, I was diagnosed with a heart problem, and then they realized it was very serious, and I was rushed along a hospital corridor. And I remember hearing a young doctor saying, "We're losing him." And I got into the operating theatre and I was flung on the table, and the surgeon immediately inserted something into my thigh. And looking at the monitor, he said, "Your right coronary artery is completely blocked. We'll have to work fast." Now, I had just said goodbye to my wife at the door, and both she and I had complete peace. And a sense of complete peace that if the Lord was going to take me to himself by this means, so be it. And I had no sense of fear. I had complete peace and calm as the surgeon worked through. And when he'd finished, he said, "I don't know what to say to you. You should be dead." I said, "Why's that?" He said, "Because you were heading for a massive heart attack. And why you didn't have it, I don't know, because if you did have it and you had lived, your quality of life would have been less than 5%. So all I can say is that in those near seconds, near death, very near death, I had a sense of peace. And that's all I can say. I know other people have reported all kinds of different things, but what they prove, people feeling light and all this kind of thing, what it proves, I'm not sure. But what my experience establishes that when you come to that kind of experience, God does his work in giving you peace. Now that's real because Christ promised that we would have peace, a unique kind of peace in the face of death. And that's absolutely real. So I would look in any records of these for what do they do? What do they say to us in terms of our relationship with God?
Thank you. I think that's very helpful to bring it down to that personal question of what does it mean for me in my relationship to God? Final question. Fabian asks, are there certain things like love, consciousness, and so on that will always transcend what science can measure? And do you think that is a good argument against materialism?
What you're speaking about there is something that I've been very interested in for many years, and that is, does science, and that means the natural sciences, Naturwissenschaften. If you translate science as Wissenschaft, of course it has no limits, in the sense that knowledge has no limits. But let's think of Naturwissenschaft. Does science have limits? And the answer is yes. And I think the really good, great scientists have seen that. Now, I say that against a background of what's called scientism, which in German is Scientismus. And that's the idea that science, natural science, is the only way to truth. Now, that's logical nonsense, actually, because the statement, science is the only way to truth, is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. And this might be the wrong time in the afternoon to get into that kind of logic. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are a surprising number of people that think that that is true. Dawkins is one of them. Hawking was another. But really great people, let's take Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize. And he said this, he said, it's very easy to see that the natural sciences are limited. They cannot even answer the simple questions of a child. Where did I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of my life? And Einstein saw the limit, as did that other Nobel Prize winner, the brilliant American Nobel Prize winner of physics. He could see that ethics is outside the realm of science. Einstein said you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. And I think that's absolutely true. That, let me put it this way, if science was the key to everything, half of the faculties in all Swiss universities would have to close tomorrow, except technical universities, I suppose, because we'd have no history, we'd have no literature, etc., etc. And it is interesting that Sir Peter Medawar, who was writing this book called Advice to a Young Scientist, said in it, you need to go outside science to literature and philosophy, and I would add, of course, to the religion, theology, and so on, that science is limited. It's very good at answering the how questions, the what questions, and the why of function. Why is that bit here? But it does not deal with the why of purpose. And of course, it's the why of purpose that is of most interest to me. Why am I? Why am I here? What is the meaning of my life? And it's very interesting to notice in my lifetime, in recent years, God and science that we've been discussing today are still very much on the agenda. But questions of meaning are even more on the agenda, particularly of young people. Where can I find meaning in life? And they're fed up, many of them, with the materialistic and scientific solutions, and they cannot find meaning. And that's why I want to refer them to the full-orbed message of Christianity, which tells us where we can find meaning, not in a discipline, but in a person.
John, I think that is the perfect last word. Thank you so, so much. We will have an Aperol Riche tonight, like for food of the body, but I think you have given us a full Aperol Riche, food for thought. Thank you so much for answering all our questions. We didn't feel any like illnesses of yours. So thank you for being so much to the point and for taking the time. Yeah, just from the bottom of my heart and from all of us, thank you very much, and God's blessing for you and also for Sally, your wife.
Well, you see, the very fact that you didn't see any illness or any signs shows that consciousness is not the same as the brain.
Sorry, I think everyone was applauding, so we didn't get your last point.
Oh, that doesn't matter. I said that the very fact that you didn't see any signs of illness shows that consciousness is not the same as my consciousness, is not as the same as your observation of my brain. So thank you very much. It's been lovely to be with you.
Merci vielmals. Thank you so much, John.
Tschüss.
Tschüss.